Hi, I'm McEwen. I sewed this Juneau COVID quilt with funds that were awarded by the Juneau Arts and Humanities Council through the Juneau CARES ArtWorks grant. This quilt is a visual representation of COVID cases in Juneau, and it's basically like a big bar graph. The time is going this way, so we're starting here in mid-March when we first started counting COVID cases in Juneau. And each row is 1 week worth of time starting on Sunday. And it starts with March and goes through the summer and then ends down at the last week of December, down at the bottom. The background colors are related to the level of the preparedness level for Juneau that was assigned by CBJ, Emergency Operations Center. The gray is when there was no level assigned, and then they started in midsummer putting us at level 1, 2, 3 based on the risk level. So the lighter pink is a low risk level, and the slightly darker pink or light red is the moderate risk level. So you can see over time how our risk level changed as well. Each square is one case or one person. Often when we look at COVID, it's in a rate per 100,000 residents, or we have different ways of looking at things with data. Each square represents one case or one person, and they're included in the week where the date is reported for first having symptoms. So we start out low with 1 case in a week, 10 cases in a week. A few weeks with no new cases reported. Going through summer, you can see the first big peak in summer, going over to a high of 84 cases on this graph that happened, I believe, around the end of October. On the side of the quilt, we have these 5 squares that represent the five deaths that happened among Juneau residents that were attributed to COVID. A couple of those happened out of state, but the people who passed were listed as being Juneau residents. This data comes from the state of Alaska Department of Health and Social Services. I downloaded their data weekly or even daily to get updated numbers for COVID cases among Juneau residents. When the Juneau Arts and Humanities Council gave a call for art that was COVID related, what first came to mind for me was art that could be a representation of the people behind the numbers. When the pandemic first started and all throughout the summer, I was checking the news every day and looking online and in the newspaper and the CDC website and the city and the New York Times and all of these different places that were reporting data on COVID cases every single day. And I know a lot of people who were doing the same thing, checking the numbers every day with this kind of obsession to see what was happening. And I come from a public health data background, and my degree is in public health. So I have a lot of experience in that kind of work professionally, counting the numbers and thinking of different ways to display data graphically, and there's a lot of different ways to do that. But one thing that happens when you get so absorbed with the numbers and the data is that you forget that these are real people that we're talking about, real people who were pretty frightened when they tested positive for COVID, or people who passed away who have loved ones here. And so this was a way to kind of put some humanity back in the numbers that were being reported for COVID cases among Juneau residents. And so this was really a way to kind of capture a point in time of how the pandemic played out in Juneau I know if you made something similar for a different community, it would look a lot different. We've looked at enough graphs to know, most places had that big increase in the summer and then another increase at the end of the year, and we can see that in Juneau too. But there's also, when I look at this, I see the higher numbers near the end of the year, and I think, we had a cluster among the homeless population in Juneau, and that shows when that happened. Obviously, these squares don't identify any people, but they tell the story of what was happening when cases went up and cases went down, when our risk level was raised and when our risk level was lowered. One interesting thing about sewing this quilt and doing this project was that I had a really short time frame in which to do it. And the Juneau Arts and Humanities Council had awarded funding late in the year, and we had a deadline to work with where everything needed to be completed and turned in by December 30th. And so I knew that I wanted to represent this period of time, but the period of time was happening now. And so I was able to kind of had to start at the beginning, knowing that things were going to change as I sewed. And so, we were about here when I started. I didn't know what the background color was going to be at the end of the quilt. I didn't know how far this direction we would have to extend. When I was originally laying things out, I was looking at the numbers and thinking about how wide the quilt would need to be in order to capture all of the cases. The quilt's narrower than I thought it was going to be. We top out at 84 cases in 1 week, and when I was planning, my guess was that we would be at 100 cases in a week by December. And fortunately, Juneau never got that high, which is great. But it really added a layer of complexity to planning the project, to not know what the finished product was going to look like or even how big it would need to be before I completed it. So that being said, public health data changes all the time. We get new and updated information, and so I re-downloaded the data set just yesterday. It's April now, so 4 months have passed since I've completed this project, and some of the numbers are a little bit different. So you may look at this in the future and say, oh, these numbers are actually not quite right. This is what the data looked like at the end of December in 2020. This is what we had. And some things have since updated, and that's how science works. We use the best data that we have available, and new data come along and update things, but this really is representing a point in time and what the information was at the time. My plan was, once I figured out which fabrics I was going to use and how big each of the cases would be, I sewed these small units of the light fabric with the dark fabric next to it, and I was able to do a lot of those because, as I said, I didn't know exactly how many cases would be in some of the weeks that were coming, and so I had to kind of hedge my bets as far as what I could make ahead of time and what I would need to assemble later on in the process. I quilted all of it on a vintage sewing machine from the 1940s that's about this big. So a lot of people who quilt have used giant machines that feed it in. This was done in a small scale sort of way and had to be creative. If you look closely, it's not perfect, and that, for me, I'm not a super professional quilter. It's not what I do as a vocation. You'll meet some quilters who, do everything perfectly. For me, this was more just using the fabric to represent an idea, and it's more about the visuals of the finished piece than it is about the technicality of how it went together. It's by no means perfect, but what it does do is put a human face on some the harder numbers that we got accustomed to following during the pandemic. So to talk about the process that I used to get the numbers that I used in making this quilt, my process was to download information from the Alaska Department of Health and Social Services. They have a COVID dashboard online with some easy to read summary data, but they also have the full data behind the tables that's available for download and mapping. And as I was saying before, we're so interested in slicing and dicing this public health data in 1,000 different ways, and there's really a lot of different ways to look at it. For this project, I wanted it to be Juneau specific, of course, and I also wanted it to be based on people. And so that meant for me that the right data set to use was called onset date, and I would download that from the DHSS website and filter it for Juneau residents and filter it for, and sort it by date. And I did some recoding of the variables to be able to sort it into week-long spans of time to get the case numbers for the week. And so that was how I went from that data set to this display of the data. And I used the computer a lot to get it, but I also used a lot of paper in tracking the project as things were going along and as I was completing parts of it. And I like to check things off on paper, and there were a lot of sticky notes moving around as I updated the data throughout the project and had new information to work with. I think they go together so well, because when we're reporting science, you know, the first thing we look at is a graph, and that there's a lot of different ways that you can display data so that it makes sense. And being able to really display information in a concise way, there's an art to that. There's an art to what colors you choose and what you use for your x-axis and your y-axis to make things display in a way that's intuitive for people looking at it to be able to absorb it. And so for this project, you know, in choosing the fabrics and the stitches and the kind of uneven stitches of it is a way to kind of bring some humanities back into just the hard, cold numbers. It's a way of recording the pandemic and how it looked in our town, and how it started out with just a few cases and tapered off, and then, you know, maybe people weren't so worried, and then things picked up again and people did worry, and then seeing our risk levels increased by the city government, and seeing how things really got quite high in the fall and then kind of started tapering off again at the end of the year. So it tells the story of how many COVID cases. It tells the story of losing a handful of people. And while it doesn't have any names or any personal or identifying details about any of those people, I hope that it memorializes those people in a way, and I hope it serves as a reminder that, you know, each of these was a person who felt sick or was scared or, you know, was affected in some way, and all of these people had families that were affected, and it's a way of just recording that and remembering what a strange year 2020 was. Well, I do have people that I want to thank, and that, you know, First of all, the city for deciding to spend CARES Act funding in this way. I'm so happy to live in a city where art is valued, and looking at the other projects that were funded through this grant project, I think it's amazing that the city now has these objects that were created in this kind of COVID times time capsule in a way. And I think that prioritizing artists to receive some business at a time when a lot of us had a really big drop in business without having a tourist season, it affected a lot of people's income. So I think it's really cool that the city decided to spend some of their money that way. So I'm grateful to CBJ for that, and the Juneau Arts and Humanities Council for overseeing it. And I also want to thank my friend Kim, who was my right-hand woman during this project. And she and I worked together, and she helped me with ironing. She just ironed and ironed and ironed while I sewed and sewed and sewed. And it was, you know, during a time that was really isolating for a lot of people, and she's the only person that I saw in person for all of last fall. And we met at the Juneau Maker Space several evenings a week, about 10 feet apart with our masks on, with the fans going, and we were still nervous to be in the same room as each other, but she decided that she was willing to help me in person. And so for that I'm really grateful that she, not only to have her support for the sewing, she is also someone who worked with public health data. We worked together, and I would run ideas past her as far as, well, what do you think the case count will be like later in December? And she and I worked together for a guess for the last week of cases, because at the time this was due, that data hadn't been reported yet, and we had to do our best guess. And I looked it up yesterday, and we were off by 1. So we got pretty close. So yeah, there's a lot that I have to be grateful for this process and getting this project completed.